All right, I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. It's a special meeting for Tuesday, April 5th. First item on our agenda this evening is review and update of the 2011-2012 budget. Susan, Christy?
Christy.
What we're going to go through tonight is all of the information we've compiled from all of our community input, from the staff's input, from the principal director input, all of that kind of stuff, and summarize that, and then go through and give a financial update of what the state is now telling us, and then also go through what some of the recommendations are based upon all the input received and what the administration's thoughts are at this point. We garnered so much feedback. It was a lot of data to sort through, and we're trying to summarize it for you tonight because we don't want to inundate everybody with information that they can't make heads or tails of. So there's been a lot of comments received. Every single one of them was listened to. Every single one of them was compiled and put into various databases. And so we tried to look at it from a big picture perspective and give you guys the overview of what that looks like for each of the types of input that we garnered and received. So that includes a statistically valid community survey that Teresa will be going through with you tonight. It includes community focus groups that Gary Suter is going to discuss the outcome of those groups. Online feedback, what people wanted to cut in the budget, what they wanted to keep, and how to maintain a positive culture and climate within the school district. Collaborative solutions was a really important part of that too. Our district's negotiating arm that works with the staff and seeing how that relates into working conditions and salaries and benefits and what they were saying. And finally, principals and directors got together and for a series of a few nights and meetings every Monday would go through a lot of the thoughts that people had for budget cuts and then prioritize them and whether or not they recommended them or consider them or not recommend them as budget cuts, and prioritize them that way based upon a set rubric that included the impact to staff, that included the impact to students, and legalities and those kind of things. So those were all of we tried to get a real broad-based view of all the stakeholders and what people were thinking. Okay. So it is Teresa now with the community survey.
All right. I apologize in advance. I'm a little hoarse.
It sounds like you're a little sick, so stay over there.
I'm not contagious.
All right.
Put it that way. Okay. So as Christy talked about, one of the pieces of data that we gathered for the board as you're trying to make your budget decisions is we did a community survey. The objectives of this survey were to understand how the citizens of Garfield Re-2 feel about how the district is doing on several benchmark issues. You know, are we going in the right direction, wrong direction, those kinds of things. But more importantly for tonight's conversation, we used the survey to find out what their level of acceptability was or how they felt about the various issues that are facing you as we're talking about budget cuts. So we asked them about 6 different big ticket items, and we will talk about those right now. As background, we used Ptolemy and Drake out of Boulder. We conducted 304, or they conducted, I didn't do them, but they conducted 304 telephone surveys. It's considered a statistically significant survey. The interviews were conducted between the 20th and the 27th of March, and there's a margin of error for plus or minus 5.6% on any one given topic, but this was done with a random sample of Garfield Re-2 residents and is considered statistically significant. So to kind of give it a little background, one of the things that we talked about was the overall state of the economy. How are people in general feeling about Garfield County and their economic situation? So this was actually pretty interesting. It was pretty much split down the middle. 39% in Garfield County felt like things were going the right direction. 40% said we were on the the whole county was off on the wrong track, and 21% kind of had no opinion. So that kind of tells us there's some uncertainty going on in the county right now about the economic situation. To emphasize that, one of the questions we asked was, have you or anyone in your household lost your job or taken a pay cut in the last 12 months? 48% said yes, and of the 51% that said no, an additional 22% said that they were fearful of that happening in the next 6 months. So 60% of the people that we surveyed either had someone in their household lose their job or take a pay cut, or they were fearful of that happening in the next several months. So again, that just kind of emphasizes there's some uncertainty in the community right now about economics. So we asked them about 6 of the big ticket items that you are considering as part of your budget conversations. And we did this in a little bit different way. Rather than just give them all 6 options and say, rank these, what we did is we gave them all 6, which included a mill levy override, increasing class sizes, cutting back or eliminating after-school sports, cutting back or eliminating student transportation, reducing teacher staff salaries by furlough day, and closing schools. We asked them to rank the one they wanted to do first, and then we asked them, which one would you do last? And then we took those 4 that were remaining and had them do it again. Which of these 4 would you do first? Which would you do last? And then of the last 2, which would you do first? Which would you do last? Took a little more time, but it creates a much better analysis of where the voters really are, or where the citizens really are. And so the first thing that pops up is ask voters at the very top to do first, ask voters to approve an increase in property taxes. Now, it's not to say that there weren't some people that said do this last, because there were. Just like on close some existing schools that appears at the bottom, there were some people that suggested doing that in their top 3. But when you broke it all down versus where people wanted to see these items occur, a mill levy override and increasing class sizes appeared at the top of the survey, which was pretty interesting. And then everything else kind of fell in the middle, with closing schools, obviously, as the very last resort. Go ahead. So one of the other things we specifically tested to help provide some guidance was a mill levy override. And we tested it 2 different ways. We tested it at $2.5 million, and we tested it at $2 million. And at $2.5 million, it was a dead heat, 45-45 with 10% undecided. Ironically, at $2 million, it was 41% for, 52% against. So we think that's probably a few voters or a few citizens, and it's probably just kind of tells us that since there's not really a statistically significant difference between going for less than more, so probably in that kind of situation you want to go ahead and ask for more. The other component of this that we asked is, if you were to run a mill, would it make a difference to you if you sunsetted it or not? In other words, had it go for a specific period of time? We asked about 5 years. Go ahead. Take place. And that changed things a little bit. The dark blue is without a sunset. The light blue is with a sunset. And so if the mill levy override were to expire in 5 years, you see the in favors go up by 6% and the against go down by 3%. It sways those undecided voters particularly. So, based on this, sunsetting a mill levy override looks like it would be a little more successful than not. Now, one of the things that I want to make clear, and that Tommy and Drake, or Bob Drake with Tommy and Drake told us, is that they typically don't run these kinds of polls or surveys this far out from an election. So it's really kind of early for them, to be looking at this kind of data for anything that might happen in November. But this gives us some really good foundation work on what that might look like.
So when would they normally do that? I mean,
July or August.
For a November election?
Yeah.
So from a board standpoint, you wouldn't wait until July or August to do that, would you normally?
Well, that's when you have to decide, yeah,
That's when you'd have to decide.
Have to have all the stuff
Okay.
to the county.
to get on the ballot and stuff.
Right.
So the board would have to decide before that if that's when you decide to go. I mean, okay.
Yeah, but
I thought we'd done some of these in the past where we did them far enough in advance where we had some ideas of where we stood as of that day.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's kind of the high-level overview of how the citizens of Garfield Re-2 feel about those 6 big-ticket items that you guys are considering.
Other than the mill levy override, were there other specific questions on classroom size, athletics, those type of things?
There were. We asked people if they felt that spending tax dollars on, we gave them a list of options of what kinds of things they feel that spending tax dollars was appropriate, and certainly keeping teachers, retaining teachers, and keeping class sizes low were among the top of those that list. They thought that those were appropriate things to spend tax dollars on.
Questions for Teresa?
Any other questions about?
Well, I guess I'm confused because if we don't go to the polls until November for mill levy override, it's kind of like after the fact for this year already because the school year starts before the polls open in November. I mean, it doesn't really help our budget for this year unless we're just going to deficit spend the whole thing and wipe out whatever we have left. So that's one problem I have. And the other thing is if it's 50-50 and it doesn't pass, then it's not like it's 60-40 or 70-30, and you're talking about 60% of the population without jobs. I can't imagine if they don't have jobs.
Not necessarily without jobs. It was people
with
who
pay
had,
decrease.
someone in the household had taken a pay cut or had lost their job. We don't know whether they found another job. We don't know.
Okay, well, I'm just wondering how many of those people, if there's, are going to want to, when the push comes to shove for a tax increase, are going to push the button to increase the taxes.
Also understand that there's 7 months, 6 to 7 months of education that we have an opportunity to do. One of the other questions that we didn't put up was, do you feel like you have a good sense of understanding of the state cuts? And 40% of the people didn't understand that.
Right.
And when it came to Garfield Re-2, which I felt a little better about, more people understood that we were making cuts and that we made cuts. But still, there was about 35% of the people that were communicated with through the survey that didn't know that we had been making cuts. If you look at the people who would be interested in voting for a mill levy versus voting against, those that understood that we had made cuts are more likely to do that than not. Because they understand we've been making cuts.
Okay, I have another question because a couple of the people in the hospital came up and they went to the hospital presentation, and they came away from the presentation that it wasn't explained to them that if we closed 2 elementary schools that we could save this money without increasing teacher ratios to students hardly at all. In other words, that we had extra space available to accommodate those students.
Gary's going to talk about the community groups right now.
Okay.
So we can talk a little
So,
bit about
but I
that.
mean, when it was presented, when they asked me about it, I said, well, if we can do that, they all said, well, that wasn't how they understood it at the community, how it was presented. It wasn't presented that way. It was presented like, we're going to close. A lot of people thought they were going to close the high school would be the first choice. So I just wonder in the survey if they specifically explain that to people, because nobody wants to close a school. But if you explain the other options.
Well, I don't know that there was an in-depth explanation. The people were in, they're in a call center and you're doing a survey and it was already a 15-minute survey, so I don't think there was enough opportunity for them to go in depth.
But see, but I think that's the whole gist of whether you ask that question or not, is if you explain to them it can be done and save money without cutting teachers and pay and all that. That's a different way to explain it than just saying, do you want to close a school? I mean, to me, that's 180 degrees different. It's how you present it. So I
You
wonder
know what?
how
I
it's
went, Lee, I went to one of the two at the hospital.
presented. Yeah.
Wasn't invited back for the second session. I have a hard time keeping my mouth shut. Anybody surprised at that? I thought it was clear, but of course that was 2 weeks ago, and I can't remember yesterday. So I guess everybody kind of.
Gary can talk a little bit about
Yeah.
how the process went and
Okay.
how we did that.
But I just wonder how the survey was presented.
It was if your school board is faced with these 6 choices, what would be the first thing that you would have them do versus the last thing that you would have them do
In the survey.
in the survey.
In the
Right.
phone survey.
Right.
Right.
Which is why we also then we're doing focus groups. Is it? Okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, because to me, that's how you present the question, not it can skew your answers
Sure.
totally.
Absolutely. And when we did, first, I can tell you for sure, when we did the focus groups, it was. I mean, we talked about the fact that it would be, 16 positions lost if we closed 2 elementary schools, but that teachers would follow with students, and that class sizes would continue. Not at exorbitantly high numbers, but there was a much more opportunity to go into depth. And maybe if you guys don't have any more questions about the survey,
I'll shut up.
It's on mute.
then I can pass the floor over to Gary, and he can talk about the focus groups that we did. But I'm more than happy to answer additional questions.
That was all my questions.
Okay. I guess you get the microphone, Gary.
Don't you just breathe a little around on that one.
Thank you. I'm Gary Suter. I'm a local government consultant. Live in Elgibel. Been there about 20 years and worked in the Roaring Fork Valley and worked all up and down the Grand Valley and also the Eagle River Valley. So pretty familiar with your issues here. And I was hired by the school district to facilitate a series of community meetings. Can you all hear me okay back there? To facilitate a series of community meetings regarding the difficult budgetary decisions being faced by this board. And first I'd like to acknowledge thanks to staff, particularly Teresa Hamilton and Vicky Hamrick, for their support in pulling all of this together. Also to acknowledge Susan and Julie for attending a number of the meetings. And of course Jay that made the one. And as the new facilitator, I had to sort of shut it down, so it was a little
I had to leave.
But
You guys
he
have
took it well.
the report in your email? Because otherwise I've got a hard copy. You should have it in your email.
Yeah, I think so.
I can give you a hard copy.
Yes, this report was sent to you today via email. There are some hard copies
Okay.
there.
Got it.
Do you have it?
This is a summary report of our 12 community meetings. And what we did at each meeting was basically provide introductions of the staff and give a background to the citizens of basic school finance and the big picture. And we talked about the state funding, the property tax funding, the fact that schools can't assess sales taxes like cities and counties can. And it was really a great dialogue. There were a lot of questions from the community. I felt like it was almost as much as an educational effort with the dialogue that we had as it was an interactive effort where they actually had a chance to vote on their options at the end. Now, their voting was basically dot voting with little sticky dots on flip chart papers on the wall, but they got to basically play school board members and vote on their preferences in terms of their priorities, first choice, second choice, third choice, based upon the color of the dot. So it did give us some feedback. I really didn't want the folks, walking out of these meetings just saying, well, we want everything, because a lot of times you do this and you say, well, here are your options, and it's very easy for the citizens to say, well, just do it all. You guys do your jobs as elected officials. So everybody participated eagerly and gave us their opinion. I'll go through each of these options that we covered. And again, these were high-level options that we provided to the community members that participated in these focus groups, including closing schools, mill levy override, increasing class size, eliminating or reducing extracurricular programs, and also furlough days. So there were lots of questions. There was a lot of dialogue. There were a lot of other ideas that were submitted. And again, thanks to Teresa, she transcribed these probably 80 to 100 pages of flip chart notes as I wrote down all these ideas. And we have that should the school board want that. It's just the raw data, basically, of all the comments that were received by category under each of these options, as well as all of the other ideas that people wanted to submit. We quickly found out that oftentimes the groups wanted to get their ideas out there, and I said, let's just take them all down. We listed them, so you guys will have access to that should you want to go through all comments. First option that we covered, and again, these were not in prioritized order, was increasing class size. And again, this is an executive summary of the report, but many of the stakeholders felt that student-teacher, these are the pros, that the student-teacher ratios were already favorable, noting that other districts already have higher ratios. There seemed to be a general awareness. I'd say you have an educated public here from people that attended the meetings. There seemed to be an awareness that with the numbers that were being proposed, that there would not be a significant dip in the quality of education. I think a lot of us harken back to our school days, and I was harkening back to my high school days and thinking of different class sizes. And I think as I put in this report, one constituent said this is not a huge, scary impact. And so I thought that was a good comment to throw in there. The cons were along the lines of potentially negatively affecting the quality of education and CSAP scores. That came up. There was a lot of discussion on the para positions, so one of the suggestions was to cut paraprofessional positions rather than the teaching positions. There were some concerns about existing disparities in class sizes, and also the possibility of bringing in the modulars, dreaded modulars. So a lot of discussion on each of these, many of these topics regarding modulars. I'm not going to really go through the sample comments because I think they're self-explanatory regarding the summary that I just gave. There were some suggestions in there, a sample of suggestions, whereas some suggestions were to reduce through attrition rather than through RIFs or reduction in force. Make sure you spread out the impacts as equally as possible if you increase class sizes, so spread those impacts across the district. One was to consider incentivizing teachers for handling larger classes, job sharing, those sorts of things. So, do you want me to go through each option? Do you want to have some questions on each of these as we?
Let's just go through them all.
Okay. Second option was closing schools. And we presented this as being the most drastic option on the board. It obviously brought out some of the more emotional responses from the stakeholders. The significant pro were the budget savings. That's what people seem to indicate as the significant savings that would come from closing schools. But much of the conversation focused on the negatives. So I'd say that was probably 90% of the conversation focused on the negatives regarding closing schools. Most all agreed that the closure of Coleridge High School would be very upsetting to Newcastle residents. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. A lot of discussion again about the possible use of modulars if schools were closed and what that would involve and the cost of those and were they included. So we got into quite a bit of detail. A lot of these folks wanted to know the how-to on this. And we sort of had to explain that these are high-level decisions. We really haven't got to the point, if the board goes this direction, as to how this would be implemented. So we didn't really have a lot of those how-to answers. But staff did the best they could in terms of answering those as specifically as possible. What would happen to the closed schools? We basically told them they would be boarded up and they would be basically a non-performing asset for the district, which is another term for liability. Multiple concerns were raised about the emotional and economic impacts upon the neighborhoods and also the community. Decreasing property values. I mean, you can imagine the vision that people had when you talk about closing a school in the neighborhood, and it's not a pretty vision. So there was a lot of discussion on that. Multiple times it came up that if we close schools, that we may be losing students to adjacent school districts. So thought that was an astute observation. Concern about the existing capacity of schools to absorb students from those schools that are closed. And then and last but not least, concern about the quality of education. Some of the suggestions on that option were to consider the maintenance costs for the older buildings when closing schools. In other words, we had a lot of suggestions to approach this in sort of a business sense. So when you're looking at that, look at the structures themselves, the maintenance costs, do cost-benefit analyses, those sorts of things. We got a lot of good comments along those lines. If this is an option, to make it clear that more than one school would be closing. Some suggestions were to utilize your fund balance. Other suggestions had to do with a combination of options. In other words, close one school, close one elementary, and look at doing other options. So a lot of people were pretty astute and aware that this is just not an all or nothing sort of thing, that it could be a combination of options. Another person suggested to close 2 elementaries and leave the high schools intact. Mill levy override. Option number 3. Many stakeholders supported this option. When compared with the other options, we heard a lot of comments saying they believed it was preferable over the other options. There was a general feeling, and this came up pretty regularly, and again, astute stakeholders out there that realize that there's going to be a revaluation next year at the county assessor's office, and especially residential property values are likely to be assessed at the lower rate. And sort of translating that into, well, gee, does that mean my property tax bill is going to go down? Well, if it does, and we do a mill levy override, well, maybe we won't feel it that much. So those were some of the comments that we heard, that the overall tax impact might be potentially insignificant. It's important to note on that this may or may not actually occur, because it depends upon the impact of natural gas. A lot of the county's valuations are based upon natural gas values and the resulting taxes that come from those. So the big message in all of this to the public was that these are all very fickle formulas when it comes to school finance. You never know what the state's going to do. You don't know what real estate's going to do. So, and you don't know what kind of revenue you're going to get a year from now. The cons. We did have, and again, the staff did a great job in doing outreach to try and get a good cross-segment of the community. We did have a lunch meeting with business owners and with the Rifle Chamber, and we had good attendance at that. And of course, their concerns were the higher taxing rate for commercial properties. As you know, under Gallagher, the residential properties assessed at 8%, commercial properties assessed at 29%. So commercial properties are paying 3x plus the residential rates. So a lot of concerns from business owners, suggestions to have the parents kick in more money, a lot of questions about the cost of an election. Seemed to be a concern, and staff generally answered that, saying that I believe they're having a candidate election already. So, right?
What's that question again?
Cost of an election would not be that significant because you're already having a candidate election.
Yes.
Number of suggestions to consider a renewable date or a sunset. So it's interesting that that came from community stakeholders at the same time there was being a survey done. Also, some suggestions to consider, this is a legal question that we could not answer, consider exempting the commercial class of properties. Now, that would be something of your bond counsel to see if you could...
We have the answer to that now. You can't do it.
Can't do it. Okay. This is telling you, though, that folks were getting creative out there and thinking outside the box. So, and I said, I don't know if that's doable or not, but...
It was a great suggestion.
It was a great suggestion, yes. Put kids to work to support the businesses. So, when you're hitting up the businesses for donations and so forth, have the kids do things like keep downtown clean for a fee. So there was a lot of thinking outside the box. Again, use some of the fund balance to bridge the gap. And sort of an overview of the mill levy override. Next option was reduction, elimination of extracurricular activities and or increased fees. This topic probably created the most disparate dialogue among community members, I would say. Same with my experience in watching my kids go through high school and sitting in on these meetings. similar meetings. The pros were many stakeholders felt it was preferable to increase fees rather than eliminate or reduce extracurricular programs. So there's a lot of discussion around the value of these programs that provide focus for the children, motivation for the kids, school spirit, improved academics, student engagement, competition skills in a competitive world, those sorts of things. So a lot of people felt very strongly, do not attack these programs or cut these programs. They'd rather raise the fees. So we gave them an option to vote on raising fees or eliminating or reducing the programs. There were also comparisons to the cost of club sports. If any of you have kids in club sports, you know how much that can run. And then also numerous suggestions for raising additional funds to support extracurricular activities. The cons included a belief that parents should not be penalized with additional fees. Of course, there were concerns about the ability to afford the increased fees. Number of comments about elimination of the sliding scale.
I've just got a question on that.
Yes, Jake.
On the sliding scale, I had a question earlier this week from somebody that said, you know, historically we've always had a sliding scale for any kind of fees based on free and reduced lunch. Is that something that's required by law, or is that something that we've done?
Something we've done.
Okay.
Something we've done, yes. Thank you. Suggestions included, we got a lot of suggestions in this one, perhaps increasing ticket prices, consider other fundraising activities. Booster Club representatives stepped up and said they'd be willing to take over some of their responsibilities. Considering team sponsorships, and these meetings were not without humor, somebody actually suggested auctioning off the starting positions for your sports teams. That was a joke, though.
Great.
Let me see. Others said, offer the sports class during the regular school day so it becomes part of the curriculum. Combining boys and girls activities together, combining middle school and high school programs, etc. So,
CHASA won't allow us to do that.
CHASA restrictions, yes.
Yeah, they won't allow us to do that.
Furlough days. This was probably the most straightforward of the options, probably the least amount of discussion on this because it's very understandable. Everybody knows, most people know what a furlough day is, and we did have to clarify that the way this worked was that the whole district shut down, and basically employees were not allowed to go to work on furlough days. So stakeholders generally commented positively about the flexibility of this option, that you can pick the number of furlough days. I think this turned out to be a fairly popular option in the fact that I believe the amount saved was $110,000 per day, so I think that pulled pretty strong dot voting. The cons included decreased teacher morale, concerns about the quality of education, and then also, this came up a lot, impact of parents, cost of child care on furlough days. Some of the suggestions said if you take furlough days, don't give them back, and increase the number of days to between 5 and 10. So there were a lot of suggestions about school calendar in terms of how to handle those, and also comparisons with the state and other private sector firms and other governments that are doing furlough days in order to balance their budget. Lots of other ideas that came out. There's a whole list of these, but I think the preponderance of the people that attended these meetings understood that this is just not an all or nothing option, that it's going to be a combination of options that the school board is going to need to consider in balancing your upcoming budget. A lot of discussion on the 4-day school week. That came up multiple times, I think 7 times that came up. Calendar, lots of suggestions on the calendar. Liquidating real property assets, Big Roy Moore came up a number of times. What are you going to do with the Roy Moore property? And staff would point out, too, that when you look at some of these options, if you liquidate a capital item, well, it's a one-time fix. You can do that for 1 year, but after that, if the budgetary woes continue, you can't continue with that, you need a more consistent and persistent source of revenue. So with that, I just want to thank staff and compliment staff and compliment the board as well, because I think you guys have a great organization here. It's great working with your staff. They're very dedicated to what they do, and it's very apparent working with them. So thanks. I'm happy to provide any additional information to answer your questions.
Questions for Gary? I had one, but I have to go back. Oh, it was answered. It was on the exempting commercial properties, but I'm just trying to think through that. It'd be great if you could, but you can't. But if you exempt commercial properties, you would drive residential assessed values so high, because the majority of our valuation in Garfield County is natural gas, which is considered commercial.
Correct. If you exempted commercial properties, it would negatively affect residential just to balance the...
So there'd be no way. I mean, even if you could do it, there'd be no way you'd get that passed, because it would drive the residential rate so high for...
It'd be tricky. Just trying to point out...
I wouldn't say no way, but
yeah,
it would be tricky. I like that.
The last page of the report are the results of the dot voting. And again, you can see here that the most popular choice was run a mill levy override with about 31% of the total votes. And next, most popular choice was furlough days with about 26% of the vote. And third, we only gave them 3 dots, so we were forcing them to sort of choose their top 3 priorities. And third was increase class size, which pulled about 20% of the votes. And then bringing up the rear was reducing, eliminate, or increasing fees for extracurricular activities, about 15% of the dot votes. And at about 8% were closing schools. So again, it was a great exercise, and I could just tell that your staff really enjoyed getting out to the public and interacting with the public and having this great community dialogue. So thanks for the opportunity. Other questions?
Questions for Gary? Scott, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
All right.
Thanks, Gary, for all your work on this.
You're welcome, Scott.
Appreciate the presentation.
You bet.
The other thing we did for you on that is you can see the percentage of any given one with how many were first vote, second vote, first choice, third choice, second choice. So it's not just a group of dots. You can see that under increasing class sizes, 13% of those votes were a first choice as opposed to a third choice. So we tried to break it out for you as much as we could.
That page is not part of the email.
Oh.
Next, we've got the online budget survey. We compiled all the results from that and came up with some generalized themes. We had around 250 open-ended responses. That means that people were able to write as much as they wanted in these, and we read every single one, and we put them down, and we tallied all of the information, and this is how we got to this point. It's based upon the raw data, because there are open-ended responses. You have to make some presumptions as far as what the person's intent is, and we did the best job we possibly could in trying to discover that intent and make sure that we got it in the right bucket. And it's then what happened with these responses is there was quite a few of them, up to 70, I believe it was, that our principals and directors then rated on whether or not they would recommend or consider or not recommend those options. So that was directly put into that process as well. And then the numbers on the next page show the number of times that each one of these responses had occurred in the open-ended responses online. So as far as what are the things that you think should or could be cut in RE2's budget, the largest was an increase in fees and revenues. That includes a mill levy override. That includes athletic fee increases. That includes transportation fee increases. All of those kind of things. It was just nearly as popular for supplies and non-salary allocation reductions into the budget, was 62 responses. Classified employees was the next, and utilities, looking at our utilities budget. Non-classroom teachers was next, administration, and wage reduction, increase in duties was also a common response. And these aren't quite as common, but athletics came up a lot. 4-day school week came up a lot. Transportation, change in structure of schools, that means closing a school, looking at closing the district office, moving that to a school, all those kind of things. Breakfast and lunch program, looking at reducing or eliminating that. Service programs, training, professional development, and class size increases all showed up. And as far as what to keep in our A2's budget, there was a lot stronger adamant response in what to keep. There's a lot of similarities in the responses. The number one by far was curricular programs, including manageable class sizes and specials. Specials came up the strongest. Band, music, PE, arts, those kind of things. Then came sports, extracurricular activity. And staffing, people did not want RIFs. They don't want people losing their jobs. Keeping all the schools open was another thing that came up quite frequently. Salaries and benefits and working conditions. There were quite a few responses out there with people that believe that we've already had our teachers in a pay freeze for 3 years and they don't want to see them cut any further or get any more pay freezes. Technology was another that came up frequently. And we had so many neat responses on the advice that they would give us on maintaining a positive culture and climate in our school district despite the financial reductions. And I just put up the two that came up the most frequently, but there were a lot of different responses with that. Just keeping honest, open, and transparent communication, keeping people informed in a timely way with as much information as possible in regards to the budget. So that was the thing that came up the most frequent. And then keeping impacts on student achievement and keeping what impacts student achievement and students and focus on education was the second most common response. We had a special meeting with Collaborative Solutions. It's a staff negotiation arm. They look at working conditions, they look at salaries and benefits within our school district, and we had a special meeting with them March 21st and did the same kind of dot voting that Mr. Suter did with the community, and they came up with some great responses as well. And there's a report that I'll email you separately with all the listed responses, but for time's sake I didn't put them all down here, but that'll be good reading. It's about 9 pages, but it's not that bad. They were given the same 5 options. There was 22 Collaborative Solutions members, and what their first choice was a mill levy override. 16 had that as the first choice, 4 the second choice, and 3 the third choice, because they had 3 options that they could choose. Second was increasing class size. 2 had that as their first choice, 13 second, and 5 third. Furlough days they had as the third out of all the options. Athletic fees was 4th, and closing schools was 5th. So that was their ranked order on that as a group. Then the final process is, as I kind of noted a little earlier in this discussion, is that looking at the online survey results and what people thought we should cut, we tried to extrapolate some ideas for administrators to consider, and so we included the top 70 in there. That's quite a few for the administrators to get through. It took us, 2 meetings? Excuse me, and a lot of conversation, but they did, in the end, agree on what they would recommend and not recommend as far as budget cuts. And what we did is we had a rubric option, and the rubric included services to students, legal impacts, redundancy, administrative effect, impact on the future, length of impact, and impact on staff. Excuse me. The administrators then chose which of the options they would recommend, consider, and not recommend. And then priorities were determined and were used to guide budget recommendations that we'll come into later on in this conversation. and to look at feasibility, legalities, all of those kind of things also. Excuse me. I have a little bit of a hoarse voice today, so I apologize. The good news, I do have some good news. Yes. Any questions about the online survey? It's somewhat similar to what
Teresa sent us the comments.
I sent you all the raw comments, yeah. And then Christy kind of poured through them and categorized them. But yeah, you've seen and we've been able to review every single one of those raw comments that have come in.
I read them all.
Any other thoughts?
Did you read them all?
Okay. Great.
The blue ones, the green ones.
The black ones, red
Oh,
ones.
thank you so much. The good news is, at this point in time, is I did call over to the state yesterday, and I don't know, a lot of you probably read the paper and keep up on the current events. They're considering Hickenlooper's proposal as the worst case scenario for school finance at this point. So that's better than what we originally had planned as our worst case scenario. So that's good news for our budgeting process. The bad news is that the long bill, which is the state's overall funding bill for their entire budget, is stalled at this point because they've come to an impasse between the Senate and the House, and they're just kind of fighting over that. So we don't have exact numbers, and we're not sure when we're going to get those exact numbers. It was supposed to be, the school finance bill was supposed to be introduced April 4th.
That was yesterday.
Yes. And so far, they keep saying, well, we're not sure when that's going to be introduced because they have to get the state's long bill introduced first. And it's just interesting as far as how they're going around the process and just some internal wrangling there. But we're waiting with bated breath to find out what's going to be introduced with the school finance bill as well. So, okay, so based upon that news, we updated the worst case scenario here from $4 million down to $3.3 million, and we're just only estimating a 1% state rescission and or reduction in students. So that's considered right at this point, from everything we know right now, as a worst case scenario. Okay.
So our next piece of this is to kind of talk about some phases that how we might recommend. I'm not sure I need that. Oh. So I'm not used to using a microphone. The next section of this is talking about some phases and some recommended budget reductions. So we've been through all of this. We have the rubric that the principals and directors did. The superintendent's leadership team did the same thing, and I gave you guys access to that so you can see all those things. I also gave one to the board so you could take the time and go through the rubric if you so chose. So the next slide goes over the first phase of recommended budget reductions. The BOCES administration reduction, we have a reduction of $100,000 there. You guys can read all this. We do have one-time money in there of $89,000. These are the first phase of recommended budget reductions that we would say that would be implemented in the 11-12 school year, starting this next budget year, that these $750,000 worth of budget reductions would be implemented. We don't know the specifics on some of them, like reviewing transportation and food services. Those things really got cut last year, and we need to be careful with that, but we also know that there's some pieces of that we can look at. Creating a committee to review athletics, we are not going to recommend right off the bat that we just cut all athletics across the board in our school district. we do realize that there are some things that we could do right away, but we feel like as a school district, we have worked really hard to be able to get the right voices in the room when we're making these recommendations. And we think that if we get the athletic directors, booster clubs, and some of those people that are really directly impacted by athletics, that they can really help us know what cuts we can make, if we can raise fees, all of that. And we think that off the bat, we could probably cut about $20,000 pretty easily, and knowing that in the long run, we'd be able to cut more than that. Increase elementary class size through attrition only at this point. We know of some teachers who have already put in for their retirement. We know some teachers who are leaving. This would not include riffing anybody. All right, and this would not, because we had said if we did it across the board, it would be 8 positions. This is 4 positions. Removing personal appliances. This is a big culture buster. It is about $25,000 a year in utility fees for all of the personal appliances that people have. And so that's why that's up there. It's $25,000. It's a good chunk of change. Does anybody have questions on what any of those things are?
You said earlier today when I talked to you that on the personal appliances that you'd look at possibly a fee if somebody wanted that in their room. If they had to have their coffee maker, that particular employee could pay a fee. Do we know what that fee looks like?
I don't know what that fee would look like, or how we would collect it or police that.
Well, I know I would have to pay it for somebody at the high school because my kid eats microwave lunches every day.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It seems so silly, but that is something that really is, it's not a perk, but it's nice to be able to have that close to your classroom and not have to go to the other side of the building to get your refrigerator, get your lunch out of the refrigerator. It's just $25,000 in utilities. That's a lot.
That's where we're at now, though. We have to pay that.
Any other ones?
So these things total $752,000, $564. Okay.
Susan, back to the increased elementary class size through attrition. So would we juggle people around? Because one of the things that came up in Gary's community focus groups, and particularly the one I was at, is that there are some elementary classes that are already high, and there are some schools that are very low.
Right.
So that would make sure that we do that across the board, so that we don't have one school with 25-1 and others at 20-1 or less, right?
Right. It might mean asking teachers to go to another building.
Okay.
But it wouldn't mean riffing them.
Okay.
So after the first phase of cuts, that leaves us a $2.5 million deficit. And the first phase of cuts, after that first phase of cuts, if we ran a mill levy for $2.5 million, that means that we would be deficit spending $2.5 from our fund balance. It still leaves us a very healthy fund balance. It would also give us more time to make those additional cuts in a very thoughtful manner if the mill levy override didn't pass. The second phase of cuts that I have here totals $787,000. And that's cutting a plan time at the high school where they either teach 6 out of 7 or increasing their class size to 30-1. It's increasing the rest of the elementaries. It's 4 teachers at the elementary school. It's eliminating after-school programs, eliminating our recycling program, and turning off cooling in the gyms and the locker rooms. The next phase is 4 more furlough days. The last phase would be looking at closing a couple of elementary schools and then having to revisit athletics again.
So go back to the phasing. So phase one, we do that would be something you'd recommend we do immediately for this next budget year, and recommend doing a mill levy override at the $2.5 million range, and deficit spend for 2011-2012, the $2.5 million. Now, if the mill levy doesn't pass, you say you go to phases 2 and phases 3. But
If the mill levy doesn't pass, or if things get worse on the state level, even if the mill levy did pass, that doesn't mean that the state won't come back next year and cut our funding again. So these are things, because the second, third, and fourth phase add up to more than $2.5 million.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we have no idea what the state will do for the future, and the other is this will be the 4th year that our staff is frozen, and we may have to make some difficult decisions as a staff on whether or not we want to cut more so that we can start getting our steps back, or stay frozen.
But if the mill levy doesn't pass, I mean, you may be looking at, say, 2, 3, and combination of 2, 3, and 4 to balance a budget for 2012, 2013.
Yeah, I think that would give us some time to look at that point, if we have $11 million in our fund balance, what are we going to do with that? And do we want to rip this Band-Aid off slowly, or do we want to rip it off quickly? And I think that because of the $13.4 million fund balance, we have some time to take it off a little more slowly.
But really, you need $6 million roughly for cash flow. So, I mean, we always hear 13 or 11 million or whatever it is, but there is a requirement for cash flow.
Yeah, we have to keep probably 8 million.
Oh.
As well, six for sure. But then you still need a cushion in there for the unforeseen things that are going to happen. And in case you had a year where all of a sudden student enrollment dropped by 200 kids, which we've seen happen in this area before, we have to have that money to be able to use for our budget. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that we have to have enough money to make payroll every month, because property tax only comes in certain times of the year. We don't, it's the state doesn't send us a check every month for us to meet payroll. Where we've been fortunate as a state is that school districts have been allowed to borrow money from the state interest-free in order to make payroll. That came up on the ballot last November, and it didn't pass. I think it will come up on the ballot fairly often, and one of these days it might pass, and we're in a real good place because we have that money to meet payroll.
Yes.
And we need to keep that money to meet payroll. And we need to keep a cushion in there, not only for that, but for any unforeseen emergencies that might come along. Because, you can't know what the state, they could rescind $300,000 next year or not. Or they could rescind $600,000. When you ask the state, when you ask the CDE finance director, when will the 10-11 school budget be finished on the state level, she will tell you June 30th of 2011. So they can tell us right now what our funding will be, and any time throughout the year, they can rescind that funding. So we have to have money in the bank in case that happens. I guess what's important here is that we really want people to understand that listening to the community and all of our stakeholders has been a top priority. And of the budget recommendations presented in the first phase, we addressed many of the themes. What we tried to do was address things that would once again have the least direct impact on students and the quality of education we can provide. And school closures and athletics is last on the list because of that.
Are there any questions on the budget from our packed house that we may not have answered or you would like answered, or we didn't answer them all? So next step is?
The next step is for us to bring our recommendations to the board next Tuesday for you to vote on giving us direction, what we're doing, have some preliminary vote on our budget, because our budget won't be finalized until
The end of June.
the end of June, but we can have preliminary budget approval so that we can move forward with making the changes that we need to make for the next school year in as timely a manner as possible to people. It would also give people an opportunity to have seen all of this, heard all of this, and they can comment on it. They can send us comments, or they can come to the board meeting next week and comment on what their thoughts are on these suggestions. And it gives you guys time to know what is coming down the pike, as far as what kind of questions you might have or other recommendations you might have.
Okay. Everybody good?
Yeah, hey, I just wanted to pipe in. Susan and Teresa and Christine, everybody who's involved with this, thank you very much for the work you've done on it. That's it. Good work.
Thanks, Scott.